How's it going, everyone? So in today's video, I'm basically going to be finishing off the Minimal House, like the Pro series I did. So I did the tutorial on pads, I did the tutorial on stabs, and the one on bass lines, basically covering how you can kind of do all three of those elements for Minimal House like the Pros. But this one we're going to be touching on is going to be on drums, and essentially what we're going to go into is a combination of like MIDI programming, what sounds you actually include, and we'll be touching on effects as well. So basically everything you might consider in the entire process of like drum programming. So I think the best place to begin when looking at like what drums to include in your mix is like sample packs. So the loop section of sample packs, I'm using this Dussy one as an example, but the loop section of like different sample packs often is a good indication of the kind of elements you might consider using. So with drums, I'd narrow the kind of elements you need down to like 5 kind of main groups. So if we just go to my examples, we've got the kick group, and then the drums kind of consists of like claps and snares, hats, percussion, and loops. So basically 5 different groups, and these all have like different kind of subgroups which we'll kind of go into. Essentially, when you're like thinking about what drums I need to include, you basically want to look at like sample packs for ideas. You've got like full drum loops, which is essentially everything. So this is essentially like all the elements in the loop. Pretty self-explanatory. And you've got hi-hat loops. So you'll hear there's like some of the standard elements, but then there's also some pretty interesting ones as well. So different variations of hi-hat loops. You've got no kick, which is essentially just this top part, like the main drums group. Everything without the kick. You've got percussion, which would be your percussive group. And then you've got like snare and clap. So you've essentially got like 5 main groups, and then within those groups you can create like different combinations of loops as well. That's essentially, in a nutshell, like what kind of loops you'd maybe consider using. Now we'll kind of move on to breaking down the actual kind of sounds themselves. So the first group we want to look at, which will probably be no surprise to you, is going to be the kicks. This is kind of like on the beginner level, but we will work all our way up to kind of more advanced level drums. It's that kind of like driving kind of foundation, and typically you have a 4/4. You're essentially doing a kick on every beat to kind of help drive your track along. And I don't tend to overthink it, but my kind of advice here, which I believe I've mentioned in like my template tutorial, is to kind of set up your default project with like custom drum racks. So here I've got basically a channel with a whole different bunch of kicks that I know will probably work. It basically allows me to kind of addition the different kicks so I can skim up and down in a rack to find something that works. So I've got this 4/4, and processing, I normally just like to pick the right sounds, and the processing, as we'll run through, is very minimal on the majority of these, because if you're picking the right sounds, very rarely do you have to do much. So just a simple drum bus just to kind of beef it up, but apart from that, it's essentially the kick. Sometimes you'll find that your kicks are kind of missing a lot of that kind of upper like transient to kind of help it punch through, and that's kind of where I've just layered a kind of top kick and just kind of filtered it as such. It's kind of like clicky. So that is essentially like the kicks in a nutshell. The next part of the drums is essentially the claps and snares. So you'll probably be familiar with having a clap on the 2 and the 4. So just kind of building that basic beat out. And same kind of principle where I basically just picked a drum rack with a whole bunch of different clap samples. And I've basically just layered a bunch of different sounds. Like you could, in theory, have a bunch of samplers and just layer it within the one MIDI clip. Or you could, if you want like more control over the mixing, just have loads of different sounds. So I basically just layered a bunch of complementary sounds, and it helps to kind of thicken up your drums a lot. And then I've got the snare. So I typically, for either the snare or claps, you can use these patterns. So you'll have the 2 and the 4 one. Something on the 2 and the 4. I wouldn't go that crazy with layering because it will clip your master at that kind of frequency. It's like an offender that often does that. But you'll have the sample on the 2 and the 4, and then something that can be quite good to do is essentially do these kind of like groove patterns. So basically you want these kind of groove patterns where the notes are on the offbeats, kind of in the halfway point between the 16 grids, kind of the second 16th on 16 grids. And it makes it a lot more interesting. So your basic beat is essentially the snare, the kick, and the open hat. And you can start to make it more interesting by adding these kind of groove patterns. So basically just like play around with the kind of positioning, and you can like manually shift them on and off grid. And then like move the velocity down. So there's loads of stuff you can do in the snare groove that really kind of helps to keep your patterns interesting. If you want an easier way to kind of audition those kind of snare groove patterns, I'd advise using the Ableton arpeggiator. It's a cool little trick you can use, where basically holding a note gets you like the snare fills, and you can essentially play along with your pattern, and it kind of makes it easier to find something that works. So 2 quite easy tricks you can use to make your drums a lot more interesting. And then the final kind of layer I would normally have on the kind of snares is just the kind of snare fills. So basically to mark like transitions. So you could draw it in manually. Like I was saying, you can go to like the 16 grids. Go to 16 grids and draw in 16ths. You can do like the constant 16ths, or you can do like mute notes and stuff. And then when it comes to like processing, you can get creative with like filters and gains and all that kind of stuff. Like you'll see here, I've just sweeped up in a bandpass. Like both of them work, but just interesting stuff you can do. So that is essentially the snares and claps. The next layer is going to be hats. So the kind of main hat layer is always your open or closed, and it's that offbeat one. This beat is the one everyone knows. That's that kind of basic beat. So it's like your offbeat patterns, and you can typically use an open or a closed hat for this. It obviously depends on like type of drums you're going for. So I would typically have, I call it a main hat because I can basically swap out closed hats or open hats in it. And it can be as extreme as you want. So both kind of give different vibes. So you can start closed and then move open and that kind of thing. So those are kind of your foundational elements, and then you start getting into like more driving hats kind of territory. So like a shorter, snappier closed hat. So I tend to basically make this closed hat play off the main one. You'll see if I just select both layers, the upper layer is the open hat. So it basically plays like a kind of traditional kind of Roland drum machine. You basically have that kind of pattern, and it basically means that when you look at both of them together, they are constantly playing. So if you want the kind of driving patterns, this is kind of like the way to do it. It's to basically make sure you've got another hat pattern playing that against the open one. So I've basically got that closed hat, and like I was saying about the processing, like very, very subtle. Like most of it is one or two effects, which is majority of the time going to be EQs just to clean. And in this case, I've started like sidechaining the closed hat to the open just to give it a bit more bounce. It's something you can do. Like it's very subtle. So open and closed, pretty simple stuff. The next kind of pattern you can consider adding is these kind of like 8th hats. So you'll probably be familiar with the kind of 16th ones down there, but the 8th kind of note grid hats can kind of help to drive a track along just as well. The kind of 8th hat's kind of like a shuffle. So it's very subtle, but you can definitely hear it's like helping to add a lot of energy. A lot of this kind of, the kind of decisions you make when it comes to hats will be affected by how kind of energetic you want your track to be, or how kind of stripped back you want it to be. So basically pick one or the other and kind of have the right kind of amount of hat elements to suit that. And the final thing is like this kind of 16th shaker, which I'll normally heavily sidechain to the kind of main hat. I'll normally have the volume a lot lower as well. And then there's something you can add in Ableton called add some random preset, which basically takes this kind of velocity, which you could do manually, and basically makes it even more random. So something in this kind of 10 to 30 range normally works quite well. You'll see that's very random and almost stands out too much. Like you don't want your ears drawn to the shaker element. You kind of want it to be subtle. So those are essentially the hats, and then the final thing is kind of like that kind of snare fill. It's just for like transitions. So that's one of the kind of ways I would do like crash, but then you could also like add an audio channel, so you could reverse crashes and that kind of thing. So loads of potential, but I'm basically trying to give you some insights into how you might do things. So that is going to be the hats. Next we move into kind of the more advanced territory when it comes to drum programming. So you've obviously got a lot of those kind of basic elements. Now we can kind of start to add some kind of ear candy and make that kind of beat we've sketched out a lot more interesting. So essentially how I kind of approach percussion is fairly hybrid. So normally a kind of combination of MIDI and audio. Sticking with the kind of similar theme we did earlier is these kind of drum racks, but in the kind of previous elements I would use drum racks mostly for sample selection, but the kind of beauty of using drum racks, which we've not really discussed, is you've got all your samples there in one place and you can basically start playing around with the kind of MIDI and seeing where they are in relation to one another. So I've got this kind of clip here. I'll fold it. So you can basically start jamming out patterns. They're under velocity. It's very sparse, and I'm basically trying to fill the kind of gaps from the kind of claps, snares, and the pattern above. So that's kind of one approach of percussion, and then you can maybe start adding like delays. You could go into the individual elements and kind of process them differently. There's so much potential with them. And the next approach you could maybe use is like audio loops. So people often kind of, they're afraid to use audio loops. It's like, it's not original, or it's like, in reality, when you look at a lot of producers in this scene, like I've watched like tutorials from Coulter, like he uses loops like it's nobody's business. Like you can use loops. I think the kind of main takeaway from using loops is basically try and make them your own. So I've got this kind of percussion loop. So that could work, but I prefer utilizing like some of the loop instead. So basically cutting up loops is like the first thing you can do to kind of make them your own, and then processing them in your own kind of way. I've added like phaser, I've added auto filter with bandpass, kind of moving on LFO. Could add some delay if I wanted. And you'll hear the kind of effect it's having. So basically adding loops to kind of fill out your mix. Normally I'd try and get the kind of loop up to a decent standard and then just try and add it out with these kind of samples. And very often you'll find when you're auditioning these loops that they won't fit with your project, which is fine, but you basically just need to try and process them in a way where you can blend them to maybe be more background and noises. You can mix them by adjusting the kind of gain, or you can cut them up so that the kind of placement of the notes, kind of similar to this MIDI, don't overlap with the kind of basic beat elements. You basically want everything to have its own kind of like standard place. So that's essentially like my kind of approach with like percussion loops, and then I think I've just used another one here with a frequency shifter. So pitching it to basically make it more my own. So you can get so creative just by chopping up loops. You can basically use one of two approaches. You can either use that kind of MIDI rack, or you can use loops. So the final kind of group I'll normally include in my drums is basically kind of this loops type group. So if you ever look at like other producers' projects, this might be referred to as like tops, and they might include their percussion in there. But just the way I kind of work is I normally just have percussion and loops separate. So when it comes to loops, there's so many different types, which is kind of why referring to these kind of drum packs can be quite useful. A lot of them are very similar, but you've essentially got like no kick loops, which are like I said, the full kind of drum loop without the kick drum. So it can be really useful to add the more like top end to your drums by adding these kind of no kick loops. It's like very glitchy and it's like really good for this kind of like minimal style. A similar kind of loop which you'll commonly hear utilized is like these kind of breakbeats, which kind of bring a really nice kind of characteristic. So I've actually, for this kind of example, managed to find some samples that work really nicely together, but it's just something to kind of be aware of, is the more you add loops, the more kind of work you'll have to do to mix them. I basically got 2 loops. Really kind of skippy, and I've done this kind of like transient trick where you basically pick the top one and you can reduce the intensity of the loop. Like really glitchy kind of sound. It reduces the transients. So there's a trick for you if you kind of want to easily blend your loops in. You can obviously use like transient shapers as well and kind of reduce the sustain. So I think I've done that for both, which is the reason why they both fit in quite well. Breakbeat loops can be like really busy, so you kind of often need to do that kind of transient trick to just tame them. And just kind of helps these kind of loops to basically fit in your drums without kind of overpowering them. So those are essentially 2 different loops you can use. You can use like no kicks, tops. They normally are the same thing pretty much, but with different names. And they basically involve a combination of all these different elements. So you'll see like no kicks are basically all these kind of elements combined, and you can basically help to kind of finalize and make your drums a lot better just by adding a few of these loops in at the bottom. Final thing I've done is very similar to the kind of percussion trick I did with the cutting audio. It's kind of like this texture loop, so it's another type of loop you can get, which is not even a drum, it's like a texture, I think. It's like this kind of like city noise. So this is another like trick you can utilize it to create these kind of texture loops, and a lot of the kind of textures you'll find in sample packs probably do something similar. Essentially what I've done is pretty standard chain, but I've loaded Tantra, which is like multi-effects, and it basically creates like these really dubby sounds, which are perfect for the genre of minimal house. You can basically load pretty much any source and turn it into something pretty unique and creative. So I basically turn this city noise into like this kind of dubby So that kind of pattern's kind of perhaps more minimal, and then adding these kind of spacey kind of textures probably makes these drums head more towards like minimal territory. But so loads of different loop types which I'd encourage. They're essentially the kind of thing that helps to glue your drums together. So yeah, that's pretty much it. When it comes to like programming drums, I think a lot of the time we often overthink them, but I hope this kind of video showed you just the kind of how simple it can be, and basically how to go about like fleshing your drums out to be a bit more advanced than the kind of basic beat we all know about. If you want the project to kind of play around with the kind of sounds and build your own track from it, then as always I'll leave that below, and I'll leave a few related videos on the screen if you want to carry on watching. But otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.